Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what's making the headlines with the broadcaster and commentator Alex Andreou and the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. Happy New Year. I've declared I'm going to say it till the end of the week. Anyway, great to see you both. So to the front pages, then let us start with the Financial Times. It leads with Rishi Sunak indicating that a general election is likely to take place in the second half of this year. The Express reports on the Prime Minister's pledge to tax cuts, or to give tax cuts, as he kicks off the election battle. Fight fire with fire, The Guardian quotes the Labour leaders warning to Tories as they write that we could witness the most bruising general election campaign in recent history. The Eye looks at Starmer's suggestion that there would be no tax cuts for 2 years under Labour. The Metro reports on claims in unsealed American court documents that Prince Andrew took part in an orgy with underage girls on Jeffrey Epstein's private island. He has always strenuously denied any wrongdoing. The Daily Mirror adds that a lawyer for Epstein's victims says the royal should be investigated by police. The Sun mentions that the prince is named 69 times in the documents, adding that the king is under pressure to punish his brother following the allegations. The Telegraph says the Royal Navy has so few sailors, it has to decommission 2 warships. Operation Oompa Loompa, that's how the Star calls the UK's plans to deal with Trump if he becomes president again. Their words, surely not the Mandarins, I think, in Whitehall. Anyway, a reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of the papers while you watch us and listen to our guests, Alex and Salma. Welcome to both of you. Salma, first of all, the Financial Times. Sunak signals the election will be held in the second half of this year. Are you surprised?
No, I'm not, and that is largely because the Prime Minister is right to start dampening down the speculation of when he's going to have an election, because the obvious thing for the opposition to do is criticise him and say, as they have been today, that he bottled an election. The reality is that the election date is now again at the behest of the Prime Minister. It's in his gift because the Fixed Term Parliaments Act was repealed. But it is quite interesting because he still hasn't really ruled anything out. He's just said that his working assumption is that it's going to be in the autumn.
Yes, so Alex, are you a cowardly squatter if you've still got a year left in office legitimately?
I think his line will be that he's got a big list of things to do. He's terribly busy with doing actual stuff to bother with this politicking, right? And that would be right up until the point where he goes into the politicking portion of the year, basically.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of point, isn't it, of being able to control the date of an election, is that, unfortunately, that is up to the Prime Minister to try and use that date to best advantage. And that's why you're going to have lots of speculation in the papers, and indeed we're going to have speculation between us as to what the driver is of what he's going to pick the date for. And to be honest with you, we could be totally right or totally wrong. Yeah.
Well, it was Emily Thornberry, I think, for Labour, was it not, who was saying, oh, it's an open secret in Westminster, it's going to be May. So this is a way to chop the legs off that and say my working assumption, which I think you've got beef with, Alex.
Well, I just find his language really strange, and not just on this occasion. He does this a lot. He uses this sort of passive verbs to say, my working assumption is there will be an election, as if he's somehow a passive observer. It's his decision entirely. It's like me saying, my working assumption is that I will start my diet on Monday. Just decide. Always. Any Monday. It's a rolling holiday.
Yes. But you see, I think that's it's very normal business language, isn't it? Which is, of course, his background. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with the idea of having a working assumption, because ultimately his assumptions and his calculations will change depending on what suits him best in the scenario.
Maybe. I think there is a powerful way to express that, which is, at the moment, I'm very busy getting on with the country's priorities. I'm not thinking about an election until the second half of the year.
Yeah. Or
that to me is someone who's in charge.
Mind changeable, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the point, I think, probably. And on New Year's resolutions, they say, is it day one or one day? There we are. I'll leave that with all of us. So the question is, Rishi, how are you going to fill your year and how are you going to change the electoral narrative? Take us to the Daily Telegraph, which talks about a feel-good factor coming from tax cuts. It's going to deliver a lot of these tax cuts then, Salma.
Yes, so again, we're continuing on the sort of speculation about who, why and when this election is going to be. And one of the factors of that is what happens in the budget, which is slated to be in March this year, March the 6th. And the idea here that the Telegraph is going with is that he is going to bring forward tax cuts which will be implemented and the benefits of which will be felt come the autumn. So hopefully the electorate will be feeling better about a Conservative government. Although I don't think that that is necessarily something that you can really bet on at this point. But it is an interesting thing that the Telegraph, very right-leaning newspaper, still being very supportive, I would say, of the Prime Minister.
Absolutely. So tax cuts then, in whatever shape they may or may not come, possibly in the March budget, you know, will that be enough to change the electoral dial, do you think, when the polls are so not in his favour?
20 points worth? I don't think so. I mean, I think the point is if Labour were promising this, the first question would be, how are you paying for it? But the government gets a free pass in cases like this to say, oh, we'll cut taxes.
I think the thing about the tax cuts is that at the last autumn statement, there was a real boost in terms of the numbers. For whatever reason, the accounting figures basically showed that there was a lot more money to play with than we thought we had before. But interestingly...
Because of fiscal drag, taking more people into tax.
Exactly.
That's the problem,
Yes, the fiscal drag has basically
They're
given...
paying us back with our money, is the point.
Well, I mean, one could argue that no, government doesn't have any money of its own. It's all our money. And that's why lots of Conservatives are wanting to have their own cash back. The only thing that I would say about Labour that I think is interesting, you're quite right to point it out, and we'll look at it at the front of the eye, is that it is a dividing line for Rishi Sunak, because Keir Starmer in his speech today was very clear that actually he's not going to prioritise tax cuts. So there is this magical dividing line that everybody looks for during election campaigns.
Because if you prioritise tax cuts, it leads to austerity because public services need money. I suppose that's an answer, isn't it? But I just want to go back to the feel-good element, because today Keir Starmer suggested that the Tories were miserabilist and Project Hope that he would deliver, you know, would change that. So they're both vying for this feel-good factor, which may come from interest rates going down and mortgages going down and inflation falling. Anyway...
I think the problem that Sunak has is that there is a lag between these things. And there is a little unhappy valley between the rhetoric of the government saying you should be feeling terrific and people actually not quite yet feeling it in their pocket. Because, you know, during difficult economic times, you expend the financial fat that you have in your family, in your household. You know, you're a little bit behind on the bills, you're a little bit behind on the rent. We know from figures that people are behind. It's an astonishing figure. Something like 40% of renters are at least 2 months behind on the rent. And so you then have to catch up. And so your feel-good is slower than the government wants it to be, with an election coming in the next few months. And that gulf can be quite tricky. To be being told that you should be feeling very grateful because we're doing a terrific job, when actually your money runs out before the end of the month.
Well, in a sense, so does the government's. And the part of the problem is, if we look at the eye, is that the amount of money we're paying now on government debt squeezes what is available for public services or tax cuts or any other type of government expenditure.
Indeed. And this was a big debate during austerity as well. And it's one of those debates that sort of coming back into sort of public discourse, which is what is the right amount to borrow in terms of kind of investing and what
for green policies, for example, for Labour.
Exactly. But the point is that whatever you give towards servicing a debt and interest repayments is exactly that, is money that is not going into the front line, and whether those calculations that you make actually pay off in the long term. So I think there is always that kind of audit trick, if you like, that's done in government, where you never really quite know where the money is. Everybody just tells you about this magical balance sheet that comes out from the Treasury every year or twice a year. But, you know, the clarity of kind of government finances, I have always found, even on the inside, have been a little bit difficult to
And the particularly tricky thing in this case is that, you know, there was borrowing at the same time as quantitative easing. So basically the bank bought a lot of it and is now selling it back. And they were quite short-term gilts. They were like 2-year gilts, and they're coming to maturity now. So it's actually a really tricky time for the Bank of England buying back all this, rather selling all these gilts that it bought. I mean, it's a seesaw, because on one side they're trying to suppress inflation still, and on the other side they want growth. So they're pulling two levers in opposite directions.
Look, but in terms of this speech and this front page on the Eye, what I think is really interesting about the way that Keir Starmer is positioning himself is that, yes, he wants to be the hope candidate, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope out there in terms of what he's going to do. There still seems to be a real sort of reluctance to really put flesh on the bones of his policies, and it is about the sort of general idea of we want to go for growth. In that sense, there isn't really anything different in terms of the messaging. And therefore, even though there is a 20-point lead for Labour, I think there is going to be a long way for Keir Starmer to go to kind of establish himself as that person that people believe in, to bring that change, to bring that hope forward.
And they look at Barack Obama as the Yes We Can candidate who delivered that so magnificently, I suppose, in terms of, electoral pull, didn't he? To The Guardian then, Alex, Labour will fight fire with fire. What's the suggestion? This is going to be a bloody and messy election campaign. Is that the idea?
Yes, because I think Starmer has decided to zero in on a sort of general theme of corruption, venality, complacency. His big pitch to the country, and I think that's what he talks about when he's talking about hope. He talks about a country where the rules work, the laws apply to everyone. Everyone does their bit. There isn't chaos. We don't change minister every 3 months. We've had 17 housing ministers since 2010. If you are looking for an answer as to why housing is in trouble, you could do a lot worse than look at the 17 housing ministers that we've had in the period of 13 years.
I do take that as a personal affront, having worked in the housing department for some of that time, where I thought we did deliver some successful policy.
Absolutely. But how much more could you have delivered if there was more continuity?
I've got an idea. You get the 17 housing ministers and you put them in a room and you make them a forum and they come up with the best policy, or you test policies on them.
We'll see how many policies they remember.
Policies.
Yes.
But can I just say on this, there's that sort of phrase in Westminster when you've got a candidate like Keir Starmer, where you kind of like put someone out there and you say, we're going to do something a bit hopey and a bit changey. And it feels like that he is borrowing from something that's happened before, a script, if you like. What I think is depressing about this is that he's playing the political game, but giving a message that says, I'm different, put your faith in me, which is a very classic political tactic. But he's been in Westminster for a long time, He was there serving under Corbyn. So there isn't really that much that separates him from the rest of the political class. He's very much a part of it. So I think some of this is a little bit, doesn't ring true.
I would agree generally. I would say the one bit of the speech that really struck a chord with me, because it felt like personally it was true, was the bit where he said politics should tread lightly. And the problem with populist politics is that it demands your attention all the time.
Well,
it is exhausting.
It's as traditional Tories like to say, to be governed in a godly and quietly fashion. So I think I would say that resonated with me too.
But don't you think that hits home, that the last few years do feel exhausting?
Until they accuse the Prime Minister with a year left of being a cowardly squatter in his own property, I suppose, because it's not so lovely and godly, is it?
Yeah.
Just want to squeeze in a story in the Daily Telegraph, if you don't mind. Striking doctors are being warned that the NHS will start formally collecting evidence of the harm to patients caused by their refusal to help struggling hospitals. This is after a battle between the BMA, the Doctors' Union, and the hospitals about when it's right to call in extra help from the striking doctors, Alex.
Yeah, so, this really has teeth, because what they're saying is that if we call you in and you don't come in, there will be a little black mark on your record, effectively, that you will meet the consequences of your decision to stick to that strike. I suspect we will disagree on this. I think that's rather unfair, because I don't think anyone working owes an employer their labour
But there
if the employer is treating them poorly.
The people are called, I mean, with the nurses as well, they're called in if there's an urgent requirement to come in.
Yes.
The debate is over how urgent the requirements have been on these calls.
Exactly. And I think it's not, you know, the rules governing strike action are clear. There is obviously an exception in certain circumstances and sectors because this is a life or death. And I think that it's important to be able to have that record to say that you are now breaking the agreement that we had previously. I mean, this is why we have laws to govern the legality of strikes as well. I would just call out the quote from the Health Secretary, which really resonated with me. You know, it's absolutely for NHS leaders to decide which services need to be protected. But, you know, just before that, she talks about the fact that the NHS doesn't belong to the BMA. And I think that is really important, that as an institution, the NHS does not just belong to the people that work there, but it is for all of us. And I think that's a very important thing for her to have stated.
Well, it shows the pressure, I suppose, of these 6 days of strike action as well, doesn't it? Which we're keeping an eye on, certainly. Lots more still to come, including China and other states spent millions at Trump hotels during his presidency. Talk more about that and him after this. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview with me now, Alex Andreou and Salma Shah. We've talked about UK election, US election next. It feels like that's the subject for the year, doesn't it? Anyway, this is sort of slightly incidental, but the main candidate for the Republicans, one presumes, Donald Trump. The story in the FT is that China and other states spent millions at Trump hotels during his presidency. So the question is that bad or not? Why did they do it?
So I think what they're trying to infer here is that there was some kind of reason for them to spend money in Trump hotels
like
to create some kind of closeness with the president. I think you get really far down into the story before you actually see that this is something that has been put together by House Democrats. And so even though the facts may be true, I think we have to sort of test the numbers a little bit. So, for example, how much money was spent by these same people in Trump hotels before he entered the White House? So I think I would just like to see a little bit of clarity as to whether there is any differential, and then there would be an interesting story there to peruse. But, you know, we are about to go into an election campaign. The Democrats are worried. This is the kind of thing we're going to see coming up again and again and again over the next year.
Well, the Brits are worried too, according to a paper last night and tonight, the Daily Star. Operation Oompa Loompa. UK on mega alert for return of the Donald. Wonks urged to draw up secret plans in case daft orange man baby is press again. I'm going to stop there.
No, do go on.
No, that's what I was reading. Alex,
Alex, I think you were rather enjoying this story earlier.
Well, in that it is something that is happening. We know that. We know there's even been security briefings and sort of intelligence and diplomatic briefings about, oh, my God, what do we do? And I think, actually, it speaks to a fact that has really destabilised progressives. They thought that beating Trump once would be enough. I think that's what we all thought, that, you know, you would beat him once and then he would go away. And to have to battle him again, I think it really strikes a fear in the heart of a lot of conservatives around the world.
But there's some really big issues here. I mean, these are serious people saying it, like Lord Samuel MacDonald, for example. What happens with NATO again? What happens with Ukraine? What happens with the spread of Russia? I mean, there's,
even though the Star is presenting this in a very sort of comedic fashion, it's the genius of the Star in many ways is that they take a story like this and give it this treatment, but point to something very, very important, which is the world is preparing. And it is perfectly normal. So when President Biden came in, it would be perfectly normal for all the senior civil servants in relation to international affairs to prepare sort of dossiers for ministers and the Prime Minister to review about certain issues and how it would change tactics. They'll have lots of information about who the new people are around Donald Trump, what the chances are. Our ambassador in Washington will be following this very closely.
They're expected to really just be loyalists now, to be fair, aren't they, if he does win?
Exactly, and then what that looks like in terms of the way that we have relationships with those people, which will essentially then govern the way that we can influence the US. And as you rightly say, there are so many things that are happening in the world. But the thing about Donald Trump, if he is president again, is that he's no longer an unknown entity.
Absolutely. Just going to end on the Matt cartoon, if we can take a look, which combines a couple of stories. The general election, it says, will be like the darts final without the fancy dress or the excitement or the people's champion. There we are, the Matt cartoon for the night. Alex, Salma, thank you.